Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you don't have seats at the back, there's some empty ones at the front here, so please do come and grab a seat. I'm sorry that we're starting a little bit late. We were just waiting for some people to arrive. Patricia Espinosa is on her way, so we'll welcome her when she arrives. So my name is Kaveh Galimpur. I lead the international team at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of a very busy week, and it's only the first day, but some people have already been to several meetings this week. So the purpose of this event is really to lean into the conversations that have been happening increasingly, questioning whether the Paris Agreement and the UN climate regime is working. And especially this year, which marks 10 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, which seems like it was yesterday, but also a lifetime ago. I was saying to Giza and others that it feels like we've lived several lifetimes since then. And it's good to see a lot of friends in the audience. So we're going to explore that with a panel that has a lot of experience on this topic. Just a little bit by way of housekeeping, this event is being live streamed and it will be recorded and put onto the C2S YouTube site, so you can check it out afterwards. And if there's time, we'll take questions and answers, well, questions and hopefully answers from the panel. But if you have questions and comments, please use the QR code on the flyer on your seat to pose them via Menti, and then we'll try to pose a selection of those. If you don't have seats at the back, there's plenty of seats at the front here, so please come and grab a seat. It will be nice to see your faces here. So I think, first of all, I'm going to turn to Manuel Pulgar-Vidal. I mean, this panel doesn't need introduction, but I feel out of politeness I have to do an introduction. As you know, Manuel was the COP20 president. He's currently the global leader of climate and energy at WWF and chair of the IUCN Climate Crisis Division. But also Manuel hosted the COP preceding the Paris COP and was very much involved in the preparations and laying the groundwork for adoption of the Paris Agreement and also the action agenda. So Manuel, I'd really like to ask you what you think about the conversation. We're hearing a lot of criticism about the Paris Agreement, whether it's working, whether it's achieved anything. Should we tear it up and start with something new, or should we improve it? These are very leading questions. I know my thoughts, but I mean, how have things changed since Paris, and how should we improve things? So over to you.
Thank you, Kaveh, and thank you to you all for being here. So as you told me, Kaveh, the idea for today, it is not only to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Paris Agreement, but to think and to strategize the future by recognizing the current difficulties of the current reality. That's the idea. So my answer to your question, it could be very simple. The landscape has changed. Yes, it has changed. No, it's always changing. The geopolitical, geographical, political, economical, social landscape, it is always changing. It's the nature of the planet, it's the nature of society. So to go into that question, the point it is, what can we conceptualize as lessons learned in Paris to see if it still could be applicable for the current times? So let me try to conceptualize. And let me start by saying that in your question, there are many, many things. Probably let me summarize in three. It is still the Paris Agreement and a strong instrument that could survive for the next 5, 10, or 20 years, or we do need to rethink on that agreement and to develop something different. Don't kill me, Emmanuel, but it is an important question to be made. The second one, it is still the UNFCCC, an instrumental body that could help us to implement the agreement and to try to put us on track to achieve our objective. And the third question, it is, do we need a UN reform? No, because that is part of the title of today's event. Let me start by the third one. I am fully afraid of thinking on a UN reform. Yesterday, I was listening a podcast. I don't remember who made the interview with Antonio Guterres. And he was reflecting and thinking that because of some decision that could happen in this week, that UN could be seeing their budget being reduced by 50%. Imagine 50% of UN system reduction on the budget. So the point, it is strategic, it is smart, or it is exactly the opposite to think in that reality for a reform. Because if you are vulnerable, if you are weak because of lack of resources, you can be captured by the enemy, to put it in some way. I won't mention anybody, the enemy, let me use the enemy. Even I won't mention any color, the enemy. And you could be captured by the enemy because you are weak. And Guterres was saying what we do need, it is to make the system more efficient. So I do prefer that reflection. Can we make the system more efficient to achieve objective? And as part of this podcast, he was saying, because now there are a lot of overlaps, duplications, no, probably some things that can be adjusted as a way to make the system more efficient to achieve objective. And I am fully agree with that. So that in relation to the UN reform. But going back to the Paris Agreement, and probably I could sound a bit naive, but I am always thinking that it is possible to rebuild momentum. Look, how many of you, could you raise your hand, went to Copenhagen? That was 2009, no? What did you feel at that moment? That it was the end of the climate talks, no? That we were close to put a cross or whatever it could be the sign, no, into that process. And it was Cancun, and Patricia probably is coming soon. Patricia was a key player to recover the process in Cancun in 2010. And that was possible even when what we did, it was to switch the paradigm, because we came to Copenhagen with the top-down approach of the Annex 1, non-Annex 1. And then in Cancun, we did exactly the opposite. We started to discuss the bottom-up process, and finally we did it and consolidate it in Paris. And that switch of paradigm, it was so difficult. Probably you can immediately reply me, yeah, Manuel, but now it is even more difficult. Yeah, it is true. It is even more difficult. But there is always room to rebuild momentum, and I think that that is possible. And that will depend on how well we can be aligned in some purpose. And Lilian, you have already heard me to say what I'm going to say now. So when it was about Paris, and Emmanuel, you remember that well, we were all aligned in the fact that we must get an agreement. All the actors were aligned saying, we cannot fail again, we cannot duplicate what we had made in Copenhagen, and all the planets were in good orbit around a key objective, the agreement, and we did it. The point it is, what is the current purpose of the debate considering the current situation? For me, and sorry, and something that it is important and we are used to forgetting, we have to move emotions around that purpose. It was the agreement, Paris. What is the current emotion that we have to move to get a good COP30 and successful COP30 in Belém? We have to take care of the process. The idea of take care, it is for me something ethical, emotional, personal, that we have to bring to our insight to understand well, okay, if that is the purpose, how can we align all together to achieve that key purpose, to take care of the process? Because just thinking the opposite, what it could be to fail in COP30. What do you expect it would be the future if we fail in COP30? No, it could be, and please tell me if I am taking too much time. It could be even worse than used to be Copenhagen. I think that in this case, that could mean the end of the process. So for me, to taking care means also to be reasonable. Probably to bring more reasonable expectations to the COP and trying to get it in some way. So that for me, it is one of the elements. But the second one, it is something for me also so important. So in processes as COP, and this is going to be my last comment, we have gears, political gear, it's a machinery, social gear, economic gear, among some others. And since the beginning, we knew that some of those gear would suffer of lack of lubricant, in this case, the political one. So we have to activate the other two, that are the social and the economic. In that sense, I think that the best strategy to move COP30 and in this process forward, it is by doing this. First, to follow the message from Brazil in the 7th letter of the president, to be well aligned that this is an economic process. Because it is. The COP must demonstrate that now it is not the policy or the politics. It is a mature economy who is moving us towards the future. And that is, for me, key, probably the most important element for this climate week and for the coming COP. The second element, also thank you to Brazil idea, it is to bring the ethical debate into the table. No, the ethical debate, the global ethical stocktake, it is not just a title, it must be part of the discussion. This is an ethical discussion. Since Paris, we were discussing on this idea on don't leave anyone behind. It is an ethical principle. And it is not only ethics, it is about human rights and it is about climate justice. And that is why it is so important the opinions of the court, the European, the Inter-American, and the international one. The third one, it is to strengthen the role and the voice of science. We have to encourage scientists to come again to the table, to come back to the table and to be vocal. Because how are we planning to manage disinformation and misinformation if it is not by having scientific support for each one of our statements? And the fourth one, it is to promote the synergetic approach. Climate, nature, desertification, and people. And also that could help us to overcome the current reality of the world. So those are elements that I think can do very useful to move the process towards success in Belém. Last phrase, I am always lying with this idea of last phrase, but no, but this is last phrase. But probably we will need to think, because this is related to the second question that I haven't addressed, but I won't take more time. What we do need it is to think in some disruptive mechanisms and outcomes to make COP30 successful and the UNFCCC more efficient. I'm not sure if you are following me, but for example, the action agenda, it could be very instrumental to show progress and to communicate success. For me, that is key. No? The outcome, in my point of view, of Brazil COP30, it must avoid to have this linear way of thinking, no? The outcome of the CMA, one does CMPX, the blah, 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 it's so difficult to follow. Even the idea of having a covert decision that probably won't happen. So we have to start to think in a disruptive mechanism to communicate progress to the world. So we do need to connect more pieces all together towards achieving an objective. So no UN reform, but make the system more efficient, more disruptive way of thinking for the UNFCCC, and strategies to overcome the lack of political willingness in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for getting us started. And a lot of ideas you've raised there. I mean, you mentioned the UN budget. I was at an event earlier this week that put it in perspective, that the UN budget is a fraction of the budget of New York City. So just to put it in perspective, that we say there's a crisis, but it's really a crisis of our own making. You also mentioned that we need some sort of disruption of the system at COP30, and I think if there's any COP presidency that's capable of doing that, I think it's Brazil, but we'll get to Lilium about that. And it also struck me that you mentioned about synergies with the other conventions, but also I think with development in the SDGs, and later this week, there will be the publication of the latest report of the UN expert group on SDG and climate synergy. So lots of ideas there. And very welcome to Patricia. I'm going to let you breathe a little bit and turn to Emmanuel first, and then I'll come to you. But thanks for kicking us off. I'd like to now turn to Emmanuel Guerin, who's a fellow and special advisor to the CEO at the European Climate Foundation. And before that, Emmanuel worked with the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the cabinet of President Laurent Fabius. He's probably the most significant person who wasn't on the podium at COP21, because I remember you were too modest to get on the podium. They were trying to get you to go on there, but Emmanuel was in the back rooms drafting the Paris Agreement in the final hours and really had a big role to play on that. He's a special advisor now to the climate negotiations and works very closely with Laurence Tubiana and also the incoming COP presidency. So I'd like to turn to you, Emmanuel. In this 10 years after Paris, I still remember that plenary like it was yesterday, and with a lot of happiness. But 10 years after its adoption, we are now in a moment where we will have had a full first turn of the ambition cycle under the Paris Agreement. So the first global stocktake, the next round of NDCs, they're coming thick and fast. I think several were submitted today, so countries are rushing to get them in before the SG summit later this week. We have the biennial transparency reports being submitted. So the Paris Agreement is just beginning to function. So what do you think has worked well under Paris, and what do you think could be improved?
Well, first, thank you very much, Kaveh, for the invitation, and thank you very much as well for everything you've written on all of those issues, and really encourage everybody to go to the C2ES website to go in depth into some of the issues that we will only be able to briefly touch upon today. First, to go straight to the bottom of your question and add a few thoughts to what Manuel just said. And I can say it indeed even more clearly that I was part of the negotiating team for the Paris Agreement. In order for the Paris Agreement to not only survive, but to achieve outcomes, it needs to be reformed, and it needs to be fundamentally reformed, not just incrementally. That is my strong conviction. That is also the strong conviction of Laurent Fabius and Laurence Tubiana. And indeed, it is, I think, the strong conviction of Brazil as the COP30 president. So in spite of the very challenging political context that Manuel outlined, and while being realist about the power dynamics, I think we've got a joint responsibility to think about what those fundamental reforms should be. I'd like to make 3 points very quickly and spend more time on the third to make sure that we're looking forward and not just backwards. But the first point is on what I think the Paris Agreement delivered at a high level. And I think there are a few things. I mean, first is the decrease in the temperature increase projections before and after Paris, with progress made also in Glasgow and in Dubai, and that is obvious to all of you in the room. So I won't go more in depth on this, but 3 other points which I think are absolutely critical. The first one is that now climate is part of mainstream macroeconomic thinking in finance ministries, in central banks, and climate plans are seen as economic development strategies. And I think that makes a complete difference to how we were looking at it before Paris. Second, I think the transition is now seen as a whole of society approach, and together with Manuel, because it all started in Lima and not just in Paris, but bringing businesses and investors and cities and subnationals around the table has been absolutely central, and that's what made a big difference to the government-only negotiations in Copenhagen. But I think we also need to think about others in society, and in particular people and citizens, and really encourage everyone to discuss with David and the great work that he's doing with the Global Citizens Assembly, because I think we need to make more room for citizens and not just businesses and cities. And the third way in which it has had an impact, and I'll say a few more words on this, is it has had legal implications. It's been used as a basis for litigation, both against states and against businesses, and it has forced countries and businesses to do more. My second point is on the reasons for reform, and I can think of at least two. One that is related to global climate governance itself, and another one that has to do with the broader geopolitics. So to start with the latter, I think the main reason why we need reform and we need to deliver in the next 3 years is that we need to respond to the US leaving for the second time the Paris Agreement. I'm stating the obvious, but it's probably the major driver for reform in the short term. And I think that leads us to think that we need to be much better at building coalitions of the willing, and coalitions of the willing that are not just voluntary commitments, but actual trade and investment partnerships. And the second main reason why we need reform is because the process, quite frankly, has not been very good at implementation, as opposed to setting targets and negotiating rules and norms and principles. And frankly, this is where the Brazilian presidency is doing a great job making sure that we reform the action agenda. And I'll just say that this is also something that requires a change in personnel. You need to put the practitioners at the center of the discussion and not the negotiators. And my third point is really about looking at the future and doing just a rapid fire about some of the possible ideas for reform that we're contemplating in the context of the Circle of ex-COP presidencies that Laurent Fabius is chairing, and that is gathering all of the past 10 COP presidencies since 2015. The mandate that the COP president, André Correa do Lago, has given to the group is precisely to look at some of those reforms. So there are too many at the moment to go in depth into any of them specifically, but would really value inputs from people in the room to make sure that they feed into the report and into the conversation. So let me mention them very briefly. First is the idea that has been put on the table by President Lula, which is the idea of creating a UN Climate Council. And here too, really want to thank Kaveh and his colleague Lavagna for putting a few concrete ideas on the table that I encourage everybody to read. To make it very short here, I think we need to be much clearer about the purpose of such a council and how it would interact with the UNFCCC and the COP process. I mean, there are some interesting ideas on the table, but I would want to make sure that we're not just leading on this from the point of the instrument, but actually from the point of the purpose. Second is to look at the implications of the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which relates to my point about the legal implications of the Paris Agreement. And we think there is great potential for exploring the opportunities of that. advisory opinion. Third, as I already mentioned, I think we need to think more and better about coalitions of the willing. And there is one in particular we're looking at because we think it has both momentum and tremendous potential, which is the idea of doing something more than we're already doing on methane emissions and other super pollutants. And beyond the idea of a protocol, which is probably only a long-term objective, we're doing a lot of work on the idea of a buyers club. So buyers of oil and gas that would set joint standards on methane emissions. There are, of course, many other possible coalitions of the willing. Fourth, there is the necessity to better articulate the climate regime with other international organizations, and in particular to better articulate with the international financial architecture, which is something that's been discussed both by the COP since Sharm el-Sheikh, which was very good, and by the G20s under Indian and Brazilian and now South African presidency. But we really need to deliver on the very good recommendations that have been made. Fifth, and this is where we've listened a lot to what the NGOs and civil society have made a contribution. I think we need to have a debate about the choice of COP presidencies and the criteria for participation at COPs to avoid lobbying and greenwashing. So that's also one of the things that we're looking at. Six, the reform of the action agenda, and I won't say much on this because I know that this is the topic of the next panel, but I'll just say that we need to look at the floor of what needs to be done, which is increased transparency and accountability for the voluntary commitments made by businesses and investors and cities and regions and states. But we need to be also clear that these businesses and investors in particular have no problem with leaving those coalitions at the moment. So the response through increased transparency and accountability cannot be the only one. There needs to be a positive offer to businesses and investors. And as I mentioned, I think it goes in particular through clean trade and investment partnership. Seventh, and here too there is very strong and much welcome leadership by Brazil, is the idea of doing more to defend science, in particular in light of what is happening here in the US, but also to do much more to fight climate disinformation. And there is this very interesting initiative that Brazil launched at UNESCO. And eighth, and finally, we're putting a lot of time thinking about where could the discussion take place on the implementation of the Dubai decision on the energy transition, and how to structure a dialogue on the energy transition that includes not only climate and environment ministers, but also finance ministers, because this is in the end an economic diversification and fiscal revenues issue. And we're looking at options that range from a working group to a high-level roundtable on the energy transition. So it's a long list. The group will prioritize before it submits its report to the Leaders Summit ahead of Belém. But as I said at the beginning, I'm very keen to engage with anyone in the audience who've been thinking about some of those potential areas for reform, because as I said, if we want to see the Paris Agreement not only survive but thrive, we need to think not just about incremental reforms, but fundamental ones.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. I think that last point about having transformational increases ambition, because I think Paris has clearly been working, but it's been incremental. And how do we move to transformational levels? You set out very specific 8 ideas. I want to make it 10. And then we have a complete list. I mentioned it before. I think that the the interaction with the SDGs is important, because at the end of this critical decade will also see the sunsetting of the current SDGs. So thinking about what comes afterwards for both regimes and really bringing them together so that there's no separation, I think will be important. And 10th, I would say something that came out very clearly from ministers at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue is demonstrating a continued commitment to multilateralism, but also for the UN climate regime to result in outcomes that speak to normal people, so that people in the world understand what's going on. So for negotiators, we might get very excited that an agenda has been adopted, but for the rest of the world, that's really not particularly good news. So really having messaging that comes out that's relevant to people, that's important. So thank you for that. I'm going to go back to Patricia. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so lucky to have two former COP presidents here, as well as being a dear friend. Patricia, of course, served as the executive secretary to the UNFCCC from 2016 to 2022. And from memory, you took over at a very difficult time, actually. I remember people saying, well, Paris has been adopted, everything is over, the negotiations are finished. And I was like, I'm not sure that's true. And you were leading the UNFCCC all through the years of agreeing the rulebook. Of course, you were also the foreign Minister of Mexico before that, and had a very important role in saving the process last time we faced a crisis, which was after Copenhagen, which is what Manuel was talking about before you came. So we've seen crises before in the UNFCCC process, but I was wondering if you could give some thoughts about what you think has worked well and how you think the system may need to improve going forwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveh. Thank you for the invitation and for that very generous presentation. And good afternoon, everyone. I want to apologize, first of all, for being late. And I also want to make a second apology because I will need to leave a bit earlier. So, but please forgive me. Let me start by saying that I think this is a very, very important initiative that you took to put this issue on the table and to have a conversation. And I mean, for the time being, really, I think that it's more helpful to have the conversation outside of the process than within the process, because of the dynamics that we know in the negotiation. So I do want to say my first point. I think this conversation needs to go on because as you have heard from Manuel and from Emmanuel, really there are so many issues that would need to be looked at very carefully, that it needs to be discussed. And I think this is very important coming from stakeholders, not from within the process, because it's going to be, why has it not really been discussed within the process? Because there is a lot of confrontational issues, divided positions on so many issues that it would be unhelpful, let's say, for the agenda that we need to really make progress on. So let me say, first of all, while I agree with Emmanuel, and I'm sorry, I didn't get the chance to hear everything that you said. You probably also referred to that, but I do agree with Emmanuel that the Paris Agreement would need a reform. Now, the truth is that all international instruments can be reformed if we think about the Charter of the United Nations, the Security Council. And why is that? It's because it's the result of a negotiation among many, many countries that have very different realities and very different possibilities. So, which means my point then is, well, we need to make a good assessment of whether we can make progress by opening up the agreement, the Paris Agreement itself, because that's all we have now, right? And I do believe that it's really difficult. So I have been trying to think about it. And I thought, well, maybe what we could do is to make some kind of I don't want to say protocol, because the name protocol is not good, but some kind of instrument in addition to the agreement, right? So we don't lose what is already there on the table, but we build on it. Second, in this regard, I think that the Paris Agreement has been an amazing contribution to humanity, really. I mean, already now, even if we are in a very bad situation, we are seeing reduction of emissions that we would never have imagined that they could happen in this time. So I think this is something that we need to recognize. Now, about implementation, it's important that we keep in mind that implementation lies at the national level, right? So that's something that the conference itself cannot do. It can promote, it can help, it can build some mechanisms and instruments to be helpful, but it cannot do that, right? We need to be working on the ground in the different countries, looking at their needs. So my idea of a reform actually goes beyond the UNFCCC. I think we need to look at different parts of the UN system that are working on development issues, and look at ways of working together, being more efficient. I think we all have been convinced that, at least in the last 10 years, we have known that we need to do something really serious about the system, right? And so now we really need to do it. And I think this is a good time. The financial constraints actually may be helpful for that, you know. I just hope that the reflection on financial constraints does not only translate into cutting budget here and there, but really a substantive reflection on what does humanity really need for the coming decades? Where do we need to go? And so what is really essential? And that's a huge job. That's a huge challenge, right? So, but I do believe that this is the way that we need to address the reform in a much more comprehensive and integral way. I think that we could really make another instrument where we would be able to talk more about implementation. Because if you look at the Paris Agreement says that implementation is not, everything is nationally determined, right? And then the rest, every action falls within the national space. So we can create a platform for implementation, an international platform for implementation, but a platform that also gives a real role to stakeholders, to businesses, to financial institutions, public and private, to civil society, of course, indigenous peoples, et cetera, et cetera. and it doesn't need to be within the Paris Agreement. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I want to hear my colleagues. And yeah, Cabe, please keep up the good job.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I mean, a lot of great ideas there. I was struck by your point about implementation, because everybody says we now need to focus on implementation. Of course, the UNFCCC is a treaty body, and as you said, the implementation falls at the national level. So how can the system support that? You also mentioned the need for reform that came up very strongly from Emmanuel, but maybe that we need something new in support, and that reform could be beyond just the climate system, the climate regime itself within the UNFCCC. And you also mentioned the need for a conversation outside, because I think people refer to the Paris Agreement as though it's this machine and you turn the handle and it just is supposed to spit out ambition. But of course, it's only as good as the inputs that go into it. I actually think the Paris Agreement is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's the quality of the inputs and the context that is challenging. But I think you raised a lot of great ideas there, and eventually we'll come to Lilian, because I know that the COP presidency has been thinking a lot about that. But thank you so much. I'd like actually a couple of housekeeping. First of all, there's 3 seats at the front if anybody wants it. And I'm also hearing from my team that the hotel's saying that somebody has lost their ring in the bathroom. So check your hands. Hopefully none of the panel. But I'm going to turn to you, Cecil. Thank you for joining us. Cecil's a director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And as I said, I was at a meeting there earlier this week, chaired by Jeffrey Sachs, talking about UN reform. And many people around the table, many former presidents of the General Assembly talking about UN reform. It seems like we've been talking about UN reform since the UN was formed. So maybe nothing new there, but it seems the message from that meeting that I attended is that this time it feels different. The situation's a bit different this time, and maybe a bit more acute and urgent. So in the context of constrained resources, can the UN system better integrate climate action, and how would it do that?
Yeah, thank you, Kaveh. I actually missed our very own discussion because I was on the plane, but I have colleagues here who organized it, and it was a very good discussion. Actually, case in point, my very first job at the UN was UN reform, and I'm certain I was not the first one. And I think every other UN posting I had a UN reform component to it. And I would say the discussions now around kind of the climate angle of the UN reform is actually quite a fresh one. And I find this particularly interesting. But you're right, probably the UN will always have these discussions. I think it's probably useful to distinguish different, and colleagues who've been working in this space for much longer have talked about this. I consider myself still a new entry. I've worked in development mostly and came to climate essentially with Glasgow. But I think there are different reasons. I mean, if something is not working, that's a reason for reform. If something is working, but it's far too slow, then one could argue that's a reason to improve. But I think we're looking specifically at 2 other aspects. And one is that the climate agreement has worked, but in a way, the challenge or the task of implementation is inherently different from the challenge of negotiation. You hinted that as well. So if you have a situation like this, that something has worked, but the next chapter is different than the previous, and what got you to this point is not going to what gets you to the next point. Call it reform or whatever you might want to call it, but there's need for action. I think there is an emerging sense that we need to discuss seriously what this means, also seriously because and nobody wants to do this lightly. This is not a very friendly environment. I think Manuel has referred to this. There's lots of parties out there who just wish to feed a narrative of this is not working and this is a typical kind of UN self-serving framework. There's also, if one wants to add it, the argument I think that was kind of put forward in a piece in the New York Times last week, that everything has changed but the science. So if everything, the whole context has changed, then yes, you need to also adjust to that. I think
and I'm a practitioner mostly, so I'm not a negotiator, and I'm not coming to this from that angle. But I think we say as practitioners in the development space, we, some of us, and when I meet, especially this week, people I worked with in the past who are still in the development field, we feel very uneasy when we see sometimes what's happening in the climate space. We have events where people talk of hundreds and hundreds of bankable projects. And to some of us, that sounds like this was where development was 20 years ago. This is not how development works. We need to find ways to think systems, think sectors, think about government in a different way, instead of adding more and more projects and with all the transaction costs. I don't know who here still remembers something called the different Paris harmonization, 8 harmonization agenda, where we discussed what good development work is. And I would claim to say that it's not much different from what good climate work is, but I think we have to have these discussions in climate. So I think I wouldn't call this reform, but I think at a professional practice level, I think it's useful to have also more discussions in the development/climate space, to your question, that really looks at that. I think most practitioners would say that, the adaptation, what is referred to usually with adaptation, is where it meets development. One can say sustainable development is, as a term, exactly meant for that purpose. It's not just development per se, but to do it in a context. So I think there's a lot that can be done at this kind of practical level, and none of us as practitioners should wait for architecture issues to be solved. We can all do something to push for implementation. It's indeed true. This is now, I think, the 3rd COP that is putting the implementation COP kind of motto out. That's important, but as was said rightly, implementation happens between COPs and not at COPs. But we still, and it's kind of built in, I think, from what I understand, into even the thinking and the spirit of Paris, that learning of what works and being transparent about what you do so that we can learn together to accelerate is very much meant with the idea. So we need a platform for that. And I think, and I'm curious to hear what Lilian is saying, that proposal by the Brazilian government, I think is very interesting. I think even the analogy that was made with the Human Rights Council, where I was actually involved in a previous life, has shown that there are kind of institutional technical changes that actually have a huge influence of how things are discussed. Kind of a standing committee is a bad word maybe, but a standing platform where issues around implementation are discussed with the people that need to be part of these conversations. And that means in many countries, finance, planning ministers, and so on, we don't have them kind of at the core of COPs. And I think it's important that we kind of bring them in. But I think it also addresses maybe the very, Manuel said it, the very wise decision by Marina Silva to bring this ethical element in there, because very much saying, maybe we've allowed for the climate agenda to become a technocratic gases and megatons, gigatons kind of thing, and we're forgetting about the political dimension. We thought it immunizes the whole process because we keep this technical. Well, we're now at a crossroad where we're seeing this has not immunized it, and we have maybe missed to be more proactive about the political dimension. And in development, I think we've had that revelation maybe 20 years ago. We had an American government coming in, making massive cuts and forcing the UN's hand with George W. Bush at the time. It was much less than now, but it's not a new situation. And I think that's why there's so much trepidation.
Thanks, Cecil. I mean, you mentioned again the need to sort of bring climate and development closer together implicitly, but also this notion of a platform for implementation that Patricia mentioned. And I do wonder whether President Lula's idea for a climate council could end up being that platform. We'll get to Lilium eventually. I'd now like to turn to Giza Gaspar Martins, who's the former chair of the Least Developed Country Group, who was very active in the years leading up to the Paris Agreement. Of course, the LDC's had a very important voice. He's Angola's former National Director for Energy and Climate Action and currently Regional Director at Sons Africa LLC, where he works to advance efforts to end energy poverty in Africa. It's really wonderful to see you, Giza, and also I saw Gebru, another former LDC chair, in the audience, and it took me back to happier days. But you were saying when we were speaking before the event that that you feel quite positive about where we are. So I'd like you to share that positivity and why you're positive.
Thank you, Kaveh, and thank you for having me here. You know, it's terrible to speak after this very distinguished group of gentlemen that spoke before, including one of the cooks at the Paris Agreement kitchen in Paris itself. But yes, I am positive. I mean, I was sort of recollecting a little bit those hours, those minutes and hours leading up to the approval, and then the approval. I was asked to describe what I thought of the Paris Agreement, and my answer was and continues to be, it was as good as agreement as we could have gotten. And it was not climate action itself. So in that sense, we're sort of thinking the same way. For me, the Paris Agreement, it's an engine to do climate action, right? And although nowhere in the document did we sort of agreed on the timeframes for these NDCs to come up. And as a matter of fact, since we've had to start producing NDCs, there's been calls for revisions. So let's suppose we have a 5 or 10 year cycle, but there's been calls for revisions in between. So there's no cycle after all. So I mean, it's a machine, and we turn out these documents that are the NDCs that sort of lay out what countries intend to accomplish, and it's a good machine, and it's working. It's working. In developing countries, in particular, climate action is about development. There's no distance between the two of them. And so in that sense, and I think in addition to delivering real emissions, as Patricia stated, that could not have been done or achieved, or have gotten governments to think of them. In addition to delivering those, it really has again gotten all of us to think about climate action and to do climate action, right? Now, there are, I think, a couple of shortcomings in the Paris Agreement. But again, it was the agreement that was possible. I'm not so sure we could get something better today. So one thing that the Paris Agreement, I think, falls a little short on, although there's a recognition of these non-state actors, and I'm going to include everybody under the sun as non-state actors, right? Cities, corporations, local governments, what have you, corporate, I mean, the gamut. So the Paris Agreement does recognize these actors, particularly in the preamble, but it doesn't quite give us a good map, a good roadmap, a good mechanism for having their contribution and potential contributions recognized in the system. So that's something that maybe is deserving of some attention, but we must not lose sight of the fact that in spite of the fact that the Paris Agreement does not recognize them, that there is real action happening at that level. Okay, and it is real action, and in some political circumstances that run completely contrary to that particular action, right? So maybe again, there's nothing to fix. Okay, so that's one shortcoming. The other shortcoming of the Paris Agreement are the teeth. I remember we spoke of the teeth all the time in Paris. So we call for the things, and countries are going to submit NDCs, and yes, we're going to have a stock take and so on, but there are no teeth, right? But I think Emmanuel will speak to that. The minute you start talking about increasing the number of teeth or adding teeth to the agreement, then you start losing countries, right? So is it something that really can be done? Now, I dare say that the science is such in spite of the naysayers and the fake science and the fake news and what have you. The science is such and realities are such that the reality of climate change is very present in societies. The need to achieve resilient societies, be them in the global south or in the north, is real, and it does cost real money, and it does need a flow of resources that enables that. The same applies to emissions. I mean, I come from Africa, of course, and in Africa, one of the things that is always said, both in African meetings and even here, I dare say you'll hear that come the climate summit in a couple of days, you will hear African heads of state saying that Africa has contributed the least. But I don't think there is one African country that's not talking about mitigation, about embarking in low carbon development pathways. So in essence, what I'm trying to say is Paris was the possible agreement. I think it is working. We should not forget that in spite of the fact that it was adopted in 2015, it really only entered into force in 2020. I mean, we did 2015 and we sort of built in the entry into force clauses in such a way that prevented what ended up happening from happening, right? But it really only entered into force in 2020. So we're really 5 years into it only. and we need to allow it a chance to work. And I dare say it is working. Okay. So I leave it to that. Yeah.
Thanks, Giza. I mean, you made the point that you weren't sure that if we were in Paris now about to adopt the Paris Agreement, whether we would achieve it or not. You're a diplomat. I'm less so. I would say it's almost impossible to conceive that we could agree it now. So when we talk about reform, I think we need to think about that reality. But you also mentioned the recognition of the non-state actors. I'm a big fan of the presidency's fourth letter, which is about aligning the action agenda with the global stocktake. And a shameless plug, we have another event on that later this afternoon. So the presidency is trying to do something around that. But of course, you also mentioned that the Paris Agreement is only just beginning to work. I would actually argue that it would only be completely functioning in 2028 when the first BTRs feed into the second global stocktake. That's when the whole system will actually have started working. The frustration that people have on the ground, of course, is they see impacts now and they want to see action now. The science is much clearer. The impacts are worse and more frequent than they were in 2015. So I think there's that frustration between seeing things happen on the ground. But lots of important things. And also you raised the resources. Again, it's a huge frustration that the amount of money we're talking about investment, it's out there. We just need to spend it on the right things. And of course, lots of things happening on the climate finance side, including the Baku to Berlin roadmap. So I want to turn to Ambassador Lilian Chagas, who's the Director for Climate at the Brazilian Ministry. She's the lead negotiator for Brazil. Those of us still in and around the negotiations love Lilian because she's that rare diplomat who actually says what she thinks. And she's very candid, which is great. So Lilian, you've heard lots of ideas. There's a lot of expectations for your COP, but in very difficult conditions, maybe the most difficult potentially under the UN at any point since it was adopted. So lots of challenges, but there's a lot of goodwill around you on this panel, but also in the room and around the world. I think the latest figures show that something like 70% of the world's population is very clear that we need to do more on climate, and there's a majority in every country. So there's clearly the imperative to act. So President Lula mentioned this idea of a new climate change council at the end of the G20, and that sort of provoked a big debate on how we could improve the system. Maybe you'd like to speak a little bit as to whether that idea is still live. You heard Patricia mentioning the idea of having an implementing body, maybe something new to support the Paris Agreement. I think Manuel and Emmanuel also touched on that idea, but we're like 60 days away or something now from Berlin, aren't we? 48 days. Not that you're counting. 60 days to the end.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks, Kavi, for organizing this discussion. Is one of my favorite topics, the future of the climate regime. Something that I try to push inside the process, as you know. But yes, it's true that we're living very interesting times, to be diplomatic, because they are really difficult times for the task of combating climate change. What a year to organize a COP in the Amazon. But I like to say that we are going to test in November whether God is Brazilian. I'd like to begin by answer your very first question about whether the Paris Agreement is working or not. I heard the panel here, and I agree with them. I think that the Paris Agreement is a success story. It has made the climate policy a global policy. Every country now has a national plan to fight climate change. And more important than that, it developed, it created a series of tools and mechanisms to support developing countries, less developed countries to organize and to implement climate policy, not only mitigation, but in adaptation, which is really important for the great majority of the players in this process. And also it went so far as to have vertical funds that many countries use, and also so far to have a fund for responding for loss and damage. That's something that was not really obvious in the past. By the way, there has been the launch of 2 recent books on the history of the Paris Agreement and the history of the COPs. And I'm reading one of them by a former negotiator, a British negotiator, Pete Batts. It's called The Climate Diplomat. And it's a fascinating story to see how it developed and how, you know, in the end, responsible governments, they do what they have to do to respond to existential threat as climate change is. And that's why we get all these rules, these norms, these international agreements, commitments that they provide a framework, you know, to organize the global response to a global threat. So that's our first reaction to you know, this is a very important and dynamic international agreement, and that is working, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't need some adjustments, or that COP decisions can go further or can change some things that are not working. So I'd like to go as a current negotiator to give some examples to what is happening and what we should be thinking of changing. I agree with the panel also that we are in a crossroads, in a turning point. After 10 years, the Paris rulebook was concluded at COP29. Now we go into the so-called implementation phase, but also implementation depends on national policies to in the ground, and the countries are very different in size, in characteristics, in resources. So implementation means different things in different places. But then, yeah, we have to reflect how to help implementation. Know how to use these tools to make it more efficient in the ground for everybody, considering the very different the different group of countries that are there. No, So how to shift the focus to implementation? It's very interesting to see, many of the experts saying that, climate change is no longer a matter of environmental policy, of environmental issues. It has become a development policy or finance, economic. It affects the economic realm of real economies that have to change in order to keep growing in a sustainable way. However, when we call a ministerial meeting, as we have every year, most countries still have their environmental ministers responsible for climate change. We are just beginning to see greater involvement of finance ministers, innovation ministers, development, net zero authorities touching base. But when you see the new NDCs, the nature component is no longer the biggest one, the economic component. Mitigation in real sectors, transport, energy, industry. These will have to change in their countries in order to make the policies more efficient. Thinking about the process, I think that we need to reflect, and we need to have these conversations, because we need to change some things, and these changes can be done from the inside. It just takes a little bit of political, not a little bit, but a lot of political will, and we will have to find that in order to remain relevant. Okay, because we see what happened to the WTO, to the international trade system. It was really the big thing in the years 2000s. Now we are in a deadlock, and really strange things are happening, challenging the international framework for free trade that was put in place, that was should work for everyone. So we have to take the moments of the climate change regime very seriously in order to keep it relevant to countries and to people. One of the manifestation of the let's say the disease is the size of the COPs. This ever-growing COPs is impossible to organize. You don't know whether 50,000 people will show up in Berlin, or will be 80,000 people or 100,000 people as in Dubai. How you organize? How you prepare for that? And why this happened? It happens because some of the diagnoses that Patricia and others did here. There is a disconnection between the multilateral negotiations, the mandates that are there to be fulfilled, and the needs of the real world. The negotiations are no longer responding at scale and speed to the needs of the real world. So what happens? The climate action, is coming from the business, from coalition of countries, from groups of enterprises that want to organize themselves, what they can do together in a certain time frame. So we have to connect the negotiations, the UNFCCC negotiations, to the needs of the real world. Otherwise, they will be sidelined, and that's what's happening now. We have lots of mandates for COP30, but we are talking about other things, more urgent things. Whether the NDCs will be ambitious enough, and if they're not, what we're gonna do, and how to take care of the finance gap to help our countries to do more. Meaning that the agenda that has to be that is in our minds is not necessarily the mandates that we have to take decisions on COP30. So to bridge this gap is something that we'll have to do more, like align the multilateral mandates to the urgency of climate change, and take decisions on the real things that we have to decide. Why we're not taking this, we're not doing this? Because it's difficult. Countries have different perspectives. They have different ambitions. They have, different urgent problems to take care. But inside the process, there's another thing that I want to say. There is a gap between the political leadership and the negotiations delegates in the rooms. We hear here during the New York Climate Week, we hear many ministers and presidents saying tomorrow at the General Assembly that climate change is an existential threat to the world economy, that we have to react, that we have to act. And then when we get to the COPs, to the negotiation rooms, it's no, 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 this is too risky, I'm not ready, we cannot do this. So, I'm recording every speech here to show the negotiators in Belém. So to find this fine tuning between political leaders and the realities of a very difficult and sometimes toxic negotiating environments. Also, the question of the agenda. We have the agreements, the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement, and we have many articles. All the main objectives are there in mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, transparency, but we cannot talk about them until we have an agenda item to talk about them. How we don't have a permanent space to discuss mitigation, because the agreement it's the foremost objective of the agreement is mitigation, adaptation, and finance flows. So, but we need to agree on agenda items to talk about them. So there is this it took 30 years to talk about energy transition and include fossil fuels in the equation. So, this disconnection between the process that we have to save. I really like someone said here, we have to take care of the process in Belém. And I think that we are in a moment that we recognize that. And we cannot fail to deliver, in COP30 in all 4 dimensions of the COP. And why the presidency have to come with these ideas of there are 4 dimensions to the COP: the negotiations, the leader summit, the action agenda, and the global mobilization, the ethical part, because we cannot count in individual parts, and especially not only on the mandated decisions, because they are not enough. So you need engagement. You need the international financial architecture, the MDBs, the big corporations, the oil and gas industry. You need to bring everybody and push them to do more. And this is not happening in 2025 only on the multilateral process. So we have the opportunity in Belém to attend to that and to do something. As you know, we discussed this in the process. There is one track it's called the Arrangements for Intergovernmental Meetings, and we'll discuss this kind of things. Because even for a university student, it's very hard now to understand what we'll be discussing at COP30. You have to read over 100 pages of agenda proposals, and some of them, because there are five different entities: the SBI, the SUBSTA, the COP, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. And some of the items, they repeat themselves. So you have to go over more than 100 pages to try to make sense of what is at stake at COP30 in a time of climate urgency. Thank you. Didn't talk about the climate.
I'm going to come back to the council. I told you that she would say what she thought, so thank you for that. I mean, you mentioned Pete Betts's book. It's called The Climate Diplomat. I'm going to shamelessly plug it. If people haven't done so, please do have a look at that book, because the thing that struck me about Pete Betts, I used to be in his team for many years, he would always ask, what can we do more for ambition? And there was never any moment to be pessimistic. And the reason I raise that is that my interactions with the incoming presidency is that you are, as a team, very much the same. You're asking, how do we move to transformational levels of action? How do we respond to the urgency? So if I were picking a COP presidency for this moment in time, Brazil is the country that I would have chosen. I'm not saying that just because you're here, but we are really at a crossroads, not only in the climate regime, but in multilateralism. And I think Brazil, with its track record in the UN, but also with the Rio Conventions, I think this is the moment, and I think we really have to support you for an outcome. So just we have a few minutes left. If you haven't done so, please use the QR code on your to pose questions from Menti, and I think you can also do that online. My team will share on the chat so people online can also ask questions. I think we have a lot of people online. I'm going to throw Manuel under the bus here with this one, because you're also a politician. I'm going to say, should the UN climate regime prevent lobbyists from participating in COPs? Can I ask you that question? Lillian, do you mind passing the microphone?
That is so interesting question. Look, and probably you will disagree with me, and I will go straight to the point of that question. In some way, the climate regime, through COPs and UNFCCC, it is the most participatory one in the UN system. What it's fantastic. Fortunately, all that system has been developed by convening actors. And Manuel reminded when we launched the Lima Paris Action Agenda that it was the beginning of the action agenda. It was 2014, 2015, then switched the name into the Marrakesh Partnership. And we did it by knowing that that would be the most effective way, not only to get the agreement that we did it, but also then to implement. And later panel, it will be on that topic. And I have always been opposed to the idea of reducing participation. You can disagree with me, please. I think that if we are thinking in the most democratic multilateral process, it is a climate one. Because of the action agenda, because of the civil society, the pavilions and the voices for climate and the green zones and all of that. What it is fantastic, because even the green zone, it is a good place to promote more citizen awareness for people that used not to understand the climate debate. Let me share with you a short anecdote. You know that in some way the idea of a green zone, it was created with some other name in Lima in 2014 under the title Voices for Climate. And you know what? We did it because there were a lot of citizens asking us, where can I buy a ticket to go to the COP? The people was thinking, okay, it's a market, it's a fair, let's go. So we open a place to have them understanding better the climate talks, the climate debate, and all of that. Having said that, should we define mechanism to avoid lobbyists to come to COPs? In my personal point of view, no. The process, the agreement, the integrity of the agreement and the process, it must be so strong to limit lobbyists. Because as soon you start to choose something, so there is a journalist in Lima always saying, you should never choose winners because immediately you could have losers. So I am opposed to the idea of saying this yes, this no, and start to filter. That is not my idea. The system must be enough strong to be defended itself. Okay, let me finish with this phrase because I know this is the last round. So because there are authoritarian people in the world, in Latin America, everybody would like to be Bukele. We know that, no? You know who is Bukele, no? And because of that, nobody is thinking that we should reform the UN human rights system. Probably we have to strengthen it. It is exactly the same with the climate debate. Let's strengthen it, not try to reform it, because as you mentioned, as soon as you try to make those reforms, you could lose actors into the table. So for me, that is key. So not to define mechanism to avoid lobbies, but to strengthen our position, to defend the process, to defend the agreement, to defend the talks.
Thank you for being so clear. We're just going to overrun by 5 minutes because we started late. I hope that's okay with people in the room and with the panelists. I've got a question here about the SDGs. Can you please explain what's happening to the current SDGs and what the process is for new adoption? I mean, my understanding is that the timeline for the SDGs is that they end in 2030, which also coincides with the end of this critical decade and with the culmination of the second ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement. So, of course, in 2030, we're expecting another set of NDCs. So lots of things happening there. My understanding is that the conversation as to what replaces the SDGs is only just beginning now. But I don't know, Cecil, is that something you'd want to speak about? Just very quickly.
It's a question that comes up often and is often brought also to us. We'll see. I think that's the short answer. I think maybe also we're a bit cautious. We have a lot of work to do on the SDGs. It's 5 years is a lot of time. And there's a risk that, that there's a, opportunity costs of if everybody now shifts to the discussion of what comes after, who's doing something, right? So I think just like maybe with the MDGs under which I grew up, let's see, let's review, let's have open debates of how did it work, what's to learn and what to take forward. But that should be in addition to just going all the way up to 2030 with, again, implementation. It's not that much different from the climate space, but I think we'll see. And it's good that there is interest. I think we need to nurture that interest, and it's good to invite discussions over that, but not at the risk of kind of, it could become a kind of a lame duck kind of situation where people say, let's wait for the next framework. No, it's 5 years, you don't wait 5 years for a new framework.
Thank you very much for answering that. I'm going to turn to Manuel and then Giza just for 60 seconds each on whether you have any sort of final thoughts on what you've heard, and then I'm going to give the last word.
Yes, very happy to do that because it's been a very interesting conversation. So I was extremely specific and concrete with my 8 ideas for possible reforms, which you made 10 with your 2 additions, but wanted to conclude with 2 very simple and strong, more political messages. The first is that we need to defend and counterattack. And we don't have the luxury of time to take one after the other. We need to do both at the same time, but we need to take the idea of defending what we have before building something new extremely seriously, because otherwise we're going to lose a lot of time renegotiating what we've successfully negotiated in the past. Completely agree that if we do this now, the outcome is going to be worse than it was 10 years ago. And I think we need to share the lessons together of what works and what doesn't work to defend the impact of the Paris Agreement and make sure that we talk out of the climate bubble to businesses and to real people in the street. So it's an encouragement for all of us working on the messages and doing some qualitative testing to do this. That's the first strong message: defend and counterattack. But if we don't defend effectively, we're going to have a weaker hand at pushing for reform. And the second message is that I know that these are extremely challenging times, in particular in this country, and that has implications way beyond the American borders. But the way I look at it, those are also extremely exciting times. And I mean it, because it forces us to have fresh ideas, to think outside of the box. And frankly, that was my pitch at the Global Ethical Stocktake organized by Minister Marina Silva. I think the first moral obligation that we have is to try something new. So that is the time for us to be creative. Now, I think we've got many balls up in the air at the moment, many creative ideas. I think what is our joint responsibility, and certainly not only the responsibility of the Brazilian presidency, it's really a shared responsibility, is to make sure that we lend very concretely a limited number of those ideas. And that's why these days in New York are so key, and why I'm so happy that Lilium is taking some notes of what the leaders are saying. And I think it'd be extremely useful that the next letter of the COP president reflects what he's heard from those leaders and the limited number, maybe 3 to 5 priorities he intends to push politically during the last 48 days before the beginning of the COP, as a way to put pressure on the negotiators and make sure that on at least those 3 to 5, they've got an obligation to deliver and not just talk about it.
Thank you so much, Manuel. You sort of resonated with what Manuel said earlier about Belém needing to preserve what we have as a foundation to build on. Gisa, 60 seconds from you.
60 seconds. So I didn't prepare anything. So this is really just coming from the heart. But I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have Lilian, and I think touch on something that I think it is important, because I heard this message here sort of weaved into other statements, and that has to do with an apparent disconnect or an existing disconnect between the negotiating room and those that do not get to the negotiating rooms, right? Everybody else. And it sort of reminded me of, so I did this for 12 years. Now I'm free enough that I can speak about this stuff independently. But so one thing that I think is important and is deserving of attention is the sort of message that we send out before the COPs and during the COPs and after the COPs. The reality is that there's a build up to COPs, and those in particular that are not in the negotiating room approach the COP with this extremely high level of I mean, they expect a panacea that will resolve climate change, and it has a lot to do with the way in which those that get to go to the negotiating room sort of articulate what the COP is going to achieve. The reality is that negotiations, particularly on a multilateral level, are painful. They're slow. They are serious. I do not doubt the intentions, the sincerity, and the goodwill of any negotiator that goes into a room. I mean, people are really serious, and they take their work seriously, and they take their countries seriously. They represent countries, and they have to frame their positions within the context of, you know, national circumstances and positions and politics and what have you. But so, you know, the negotiators are not evil. But I think the messaging is something that needs to be worked on all sides, so that there's not this sense that the process, that the institutions and multilateralism is useless. Right. I think there's work there to be done, and I'll just leave that at that.
That was a very important message that came from ministers earlier this year, is that the COP30 needs to send important positive messages. And I know there's some members of the media here, but human nature loves a bad story, right? Bad news is what we're sort of primed to act on as a species. And of course, by definition, every COP is going to be, in a way, a failure until we solve the climate crisis, then we won't need COPs anymore. So I think being really clear about what we're trying to achieve. Lilium's taking notes of everything every world leader says, and you don't want to make Lilium upset. I've seen her upset with negotiators. You don't want that. President Lula has the honor of speaking first tomorrow, and I'm sure you've seen his speech. You can tell us what he's going to say, right? Is he going to mention the Climate Council?
Well, we try to put a lot of climate concerns into the speech. Let's see what will survive that, because yeah, Brazil is going through a very exceptional time, and I think he will have to react to many different challenges tomorrow. But just a word about the Climate Change Council. This is one of the many ideas that we try to offer the international community to reflect and to grab and to explore whether it's a good idea or not. But it was proposed for the G20 summit when Brazil had the presidency of G20 last year, 2024. And remind us that G20 countries are responsible for over 80% of the world emissions. So if someone has to act fast, those are the countries to act first and to provide more to help the others. So this was an idea that we put forth through the G20 leaders. And it comes from a perception that if climate change is a growing threat to humanity, as science says it is, and impacts on the world as showing this, we have to do more. So the idea is not to substitute the climate regime, not at all, is to create a more permanent body, a more permanent space within the UN system, in a capital where parties are represented throughout the year, and to integrate the different UN agencies, the different bodies that have to work to make implementation meaningful, and also to activate international lines of defense, because climate change is affecting, it's hitting harder and harder in all parts of the world. And when it becomes really difficult, we don't have within the UNFCCC a plan to defend ourselves. So we have to create this elsewhere. But the idea is to integrate different organizations that have to act to make implementation more meaningful. We threw this idea. We hope that other countries will reflect on it and build together whether it's a good idea to go forward. And but there were many mentions to the COP incoming president's letters, and I'm really I'm really happy when I hear people saying that they read the letters. The first ones were very long. The last ones are much shorter. I invite you to read all 7 of them. They have real attempts to climate thinking on them. And another day I heard the Belgian climate envoy, he said that he really liked the first letter that he gave his children to read it. So that's really something that we intended to make climate change more a matter of conversation to families and to people, because they have, they have the power to push the states to do more. And also, as was in the first letter, I think in the very end of the first letter, change regarding climate change. Change is inevitable. We have to decide whether we want to change by choice, which is before us now, or we will change by tragedy. That's the end of the first letter that I invite you to read it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lilium. And I'd really like to, maybe we can all join in thanking our panel for taking time for really excellent discussions. And thank you for all of you here in the room and also online for joining us. Lillian mentioned the letters. My favorite is the fourth letter, which is the aligning the action agenda with the global stocktake. In 45 minutes, we'll be discussing that. If you're watching online, there's still time to register to be here online for that. And I really wish all of you here and the panelists a good climate week. And thank you again to you and also for my team for organizing this. They'll hand out QR codes with all of our papers in the back as you leave. You also have them on your chairs there. Thank you all very much. Thank you.